423 years of American history in 13 minutes, America is now the most powerful country in the world. It has the largest economy on Earth, one of the most powerful militaries in history, and influence that reaches almost every corner of the planet. But 423 years ago, the United States did not exist. There was no America, no United States, no Washington, D.C., no Hollywood, no Silicon Valley, no skyscrapers, and definitely no Uncle Sam telling everyone what to do. There were only forests, grasslands, deserts, hundreds of native nations, and a continent that European empires were about to fight over. So how did a small collection of colonies on the edge of the Atlantic become one of the most powerful countries in human history? The answer is a story of colonization, revolution, expansion, civil war, immigration, industrialization, economic, disasters, world wars, and a lot of people making decisions that seemed like a good idea at the time. Sometimes they were. Sometimes they really weren't. And it all began in 1607. The first permanent English colony in 1607. A group of English settlers sailed up the James River in what is now Virginia. They were looking for profit. The English crown wanted a colony. The investors wanted money, and the settlers wanted. Well, some of them wanted money too. They established Jamestown. There was just one problem. The settlers were not particularly good at surviving. Many of them were gentlemen who had come to America expecting someone else to do the difficult work. Unfortunately, the wilderness did not care about their social status. There was no supermarket, no Amazon delivery, no restaurant, and the local environment had absolutely no interest in keeping English gentlemen comfortable. Disease, hunger, conflict, and poor planning nearly destroyed the colony. But Jamestown survived, and once England had a permanent foothold in North America, more settlers began arriving. A few years later, another group of English colonists arrived in New England. They were the Pilgrims. Unlike the settlers in Virginia, they were not primarily looking for gold. They were looking for religious freedom. They landed at Plymouth in 1620. The first winter was brutal. Many of the colonists died, but the colony survived, partly with help from native peoples who already knew how to live in the environment. The English colonies continued to grow. And this was the beginning of something much bigger, because England was not the only European power interested in North America. The French were moving through the interior. The Spanish controlled much of the south and west. The Dutch established New Amsterdam. And the native nations who had lived on the continent for thousands of years suddenly found themselves surrounded by European empires competing for land, trade, and power. North America was becoming a geopolitical battlefield, and the English colonies were about to become very important. The colonies grew during the 1600s and 1700s. More English colonies were established along the Atlantic coast. Eventually, there were 13 of them. They were different from one another. New England had towns, merchants, shipbuilders, and religious communities. The middle colonies were more diverse. The southern colonies developed plantation economies that depended heavily on enslaved African labor. The colonies were not one country. They were 13 separate colonies with different economies, cultures, and political interests. But they had one thing in common. They were part of the British Empire. And for a while, this arrangement worked. The colonies traded with Britain. Britain protected them. The colonists paid taxes. Everyone seemed reasonably satisfied. Then, in 1754, everything changed. Britain and France went to war over control of North America. The conflict became known as the French and Indian War. The British colonies had a huge population advantage. France had fewer settlers but powerful alliances with native nations. The fighting spread across North America and eventually became part of a much larger global conflict. Britain won. France lost most of its North American territory, and Britain now controlled an enormous empire. It looked like a victory, but victory is expensive. Britain had spent a huge amount of money fighting the war, so Britain looked across the Atlantic at its colonies. And Britain basically said, "Congratulations on surviving the war. Now, could you help pay for it?" The colonists replied, "Actually, no." Britain replied, "Actually, yes." And the argument began: taxation, revolution, and independence. Britain introduced new taxes. The colonists were not happy, but the biggest problem was not simply the amount of money, it was the question of political power. The colonists argued, if we are being taxed, shouldn't we have representatives in the British Parliament? Britain disagreed. The colonists became increasingly angry. Protests turned into riots. The Boston Massacre made the situation worse. Then, in 1773, colonists dumped tea into Boston Harbor to protest British taxation. Britain responded with punishment. The colonists responded with more resistance. And eventually, the disagreement turned into war. In 1776, the colonies declared independence. The Declaration of Independence announced that the colonies were no longer part of the British Empire. The United States of America was born. Sort of. Because declaring independence and actually winning independence are two very different things. The Revolutionary War continued for years. The new American army faced the most powerful military empire on Earth. But the Americans had some advantages. They were fighting on their own continent. They had support from France, and Britain had to fight a war thousands of miles from home. In 1781, British forces surrendered at Yorktown. The war was effectively over. The United States had won. But now the Americans faced a new problem. They had successfully defeated the British. Unfortunately, nobody had agreed on exactly how to run the new country. The first American government was weak. The states had enormous power. The national government had very little money, and the country was struggling. The United States was independent, but independence had not automatically made it stable. So the leaders of the new nation tried again. In 1787, delegates met in Philadelphia and created a new constitution. The Constitution established a stronger federal government. The new system divided power between the federal government and the states. It created a president, a Congress, a Supreme Court, and a political system that was supposed to prevent one person from becoming a king. The first president was George Washington, and the United States now had a government, but it was still a very small country. The original 13 states occupied only a narrow strip along the Atlantic coast. To the west was a huge continent, and the United States was about to get much bigger. Louisiana. The deal that doubled America. In the early 1800s, France was controlled by a man named Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon wanted to build a massive empire, and he had plans for Europe. But he also had plans for North America. France controlled a huge territory called Louisiana. It stretched across a massive portion of the continent. The Americans were particularly interested in New Orleans because the Mississippi River was essential for transporting goods. So the United States approached France with a simple request. Could we buy New Orleans? Napoleon had other problems. He was preparing for war with Britain, and maintaining a massive empire in North America was becoming difficult. So Napoleon made a surprising decision. Instead of selling New Orleans, he sold the entire Louisiana territory. The United States paid $15 million. And suddenly, the country had approximately doubled in size. The Americans had just made one of the biggest real estate purchases in history, and now there was an enormous amount of land to explore. The Lewis and Clark expedition traveled westward. Maps were created, routes were documented, and Americans began moving across the continent. There was only one problem. The land was not empty. Native nations already lived across the territory. For centuries, they had built societies, economies, political systems, and cultures across North America. But as American settlers moved west, conflicts over land became increasingly common. The United States continued to expand, and the idea of manifest destiny began spreading. The belief was that the United States was destined to expand across the continent. This idea helped inspire exploration and settlement. It also helped justify the removal of native peoples from their lands. Expansion created opportunity for some. For others, it created catastrophe, and the United States was about to face another major conflict. This time, with Mexico, Texas, and the war with Mexico. After Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1821, it controlled a huge territory, including Texas. The Mexican government invited American settlers to move into Texas. The settlers arrived. Then they grew in number. Then they began demanding more political power. Then they wanted independence. In 1836, Texas declared independence from Mexico. The new Republic of Texas wanted to join the United States. But there was a problem. The United States was already deeply divided over slavery. Adding Texas as a new state could change the political balance between slave states and free states, so the United States hesitated. Eventually, Texas joined the Union in 1845. Mexico was furious. Disputes over the border led to war. The United States invaded Mexico. American forces captured Mexico City. And in 1848, Mexico agreed to give up a huge amount of territory. The United States acquired land that would eventually become California, Nevada, Utah, and parts of several other states. A few years later, the United States bought more land from Mexico. The country now stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. The dream of a coast-to-coast nation had become reality, but expansion created a new prob. Would slavery be allowed there? And this question was becoming impossible to avoid. The problem. America could not escape. The United States had been expanding rapidly. Its population was growing. Its economy was growing. Immigrants were arriving from Europe. Factories were appearing in the north. Cotton plantations were expanding in the south. But the country was divided. In the north, slavery was increasingly opposed. In the south, slavery was central to the economy. The political system tried to maintain a balance between free states and slave states. But every time the United States acquired new territory, the same argument returned. Would the new territory permit slavery? The debate became more intense. Then came the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Lincoln opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. Many Southern leaders believed that the Republican Party threatened the future of slavery. One state after another began leaving the Union. The United States was breaking apart. In 1861, the Civil War began. The conflict was devastating. The Union fought to preserve the United States. The Confederacy fought for independence. But the issue of slavery was at the center of the conflict. In 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring enslaved people in the rebelling states to be free. In 1865, the Confederacy collapsed. The Union won. Slavery was abolished through the 13th Amendment. But victory came at a terrible cost. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers died. The South was devastated, and the United States now faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding. The country had survived its greatest internal crisis, but the next transformation would be even bigger, because America was about to become an industrial superpower. The Industrial Revolution arrives before the Civil War. The United States was already developing industries. After the war, industrialization accelerated. Railroads connected the country. Factories expanded. Steel production exploded. Oil became increasingly important. Cities grew rapidly, and millions of immigrants arrived in the United States looking for work and opportunity. New York became a major gateway. Chicago became a transportation center. Pittsburgh became famous for steel. Detroit would eventually become the center of automobile manufacturing. The United States had enormous natural resources: coal, iron, oil, timber, fertile farmland, and a rapidly growing population. The country also had something else: a massive internal market. A company could build a product in one state and sell it across the entire country. Railroads made this possible, and American businesses began growing to a scale the world had rarely seen. Men like Andrew Carnegie built massive steel empires. John D. Rockefeller built one of the most powerful oil companies in history. Industrialists became extraordinarily wealthy. The United States was becoming rich, but industrialization had a dark side. Factory workers often worked extremely long hours. Conditions could be dangerous. Children worked in factories and mines. Cities became overcrowded. The country was producing enormous wealth, but that wealth was not evenly distributed. America was becoming a land of opportunity, and also a land of enormous inequality. This era became known as the Gilded Age. It looked beautiful on the surface, but underneath, there were serious problems. And America was about to begin looking beyond its own continent. America becomes a world power. By the late 1800s, the United States had expanded across North America. Its economy was enormous, its population was growing, its industrial power was increasing. Now American leaders began looking overseas. In 1898, the United States went to war with Spain. The war was short. The United States defeated Spain and gained control over territories including Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The United States also became deeply involved in Cuba. Hawaii was annexed, and America was now a major Pacific power. The country that had once been a group of small colonies on the Atlantic coast now possessed territories across the Pacific and Caribbean. The transformation was extraordinary, but the United States was still not finished. The country needed a faster route between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, so America turned its attention to Central America. The result was the Panama Canal. Construction was difficult. Thousands of workers died from disease and dangerous conditions. But in 1914, the canal opened. Ships could now travel between the Atlantic and Pacific without sailing around the entire southern tip of South America. The United States had become a global power. And then Europe exploded. World War II, 1914, World War I began in Europe. At first, the United States tried to stay out. The country had a long tradition of avoiding European wars, but the conflict eventually became impossible to ignore. In 1917, the United States entered the war. American troops and resources helped strengthen the Allied powers. In 1918, Germany surrendered. The war was over. The United States emerged with enormous economic power. Europe had been devastated. America had not suffered the same level of destruction on its own territory. The United States was now one of the most powerful countries in the world. But the 1920s brought a new kind of transformation. Cars became common. Radio spread across the country. Movies became a major industry. Cities grew. Consumer culture exploded. The decade became known as the Roaring Twenties. It seemed like America had entered a new age of endless prosperity. Then the stock market crashed. The Great Depression, in 1929, the American stock market collapsed. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Millions of people lost their jobs. The economic crisis spread around the world. The Great Depression became one of the worst economic disasters in modern history. People who had believed that prosperity would continue forever suddenly found themselves without work, money, or security. The crisis lasted for years. Then, in 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt became president. His administration launched the New Deal. The federal government became much more involved in the economy. New programs were created to provide jobs, financial support, and economic reforms. The country slowly began to recover, but another crisis was approaching. This one would become the largest war in human history. World War III in 1939, Germany invaded Poland. World War II began. At first, the United States remained neutral, but in December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States entered the war. American factories transformed into giant weapons factories. Cars became tanks. Factories produced aircraft. Shipyards built ships at extraordinary speed. Millions of Americans entered the military. The United States fought Japan in the Pacific and Germany and Italy in Europe. The war was enormous, and American industrial power became one of the decisive factors. In 1945, Germany surrendered. Then the United States used atomic bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Japan surrendered. World War II was over. The world had changed. Europe was devastated. The old European empires were weakened, and two superpowers now dominated global politics: the United States and the Soviet Union. The next conflict would not be a traditional war, it would be a Cold War. The Cold War, after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union became rivals. They had completely different political and economic systems. The United States promoted capitalism and democracy. The Soviet Union promoted communism and controlled a massive empire in Eastern Europe. The two superpowers avoided direct war with each other because both possessed nuclear weapons. Instead, they competed through alliances, espionage, technology, propaganda, and wars in other countries. The United States created NATO. The Soviet Union created its own alliance. The world was divided into rival camps. Then came the space race. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik. The Americans were shocked. The Soviet Union had put the first artificial satellite into orbit. The United States responded with enormous investment in science and technology. In 1969, American astronauts landed on the moon. For the first time in human history, people had walked on another world. The United States had won one of the most visible competitions of the Cold War. But the rivalry continued. In Vietnam, the United States became involved in a long and controversial war. Millions of people died. The war deeply divided American society. At home, the civil rights movement challenged racial segregation and discrimination. Martin Luther King Jr. became one of the most important leaders of the movement. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 transformed American law. The United States was changing, but another crisis was approaching. Watergate and a changing America. In 1972, burglars were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex. At first, it looked like a political scandal. Then, investigations revealed connections to President Richard Nixon's administration. The scandal grew. Eventually, Nixon resigned in 1974. He became the only American president to resign from office. The 1970s also brought economic problems. Inflation increased. Oil prices surged. The American economy faced serious challenges. But the next decades would bring another transformation: the rise of computers, the rise of the internet, and the transformation of the American economy. The information age. By the 1980s and 1990s, personal computers were becoming increasingly important. Then the internet changed everything. Communication became faster. Information became easier to access. Businesses became global, and new companies began emerging from places like Silicon Valley.